Michael J. Fox, a retired actor and Parkinson's disease advocate, once said, "I am careful not to confuse excellence with perfection. Excellence I can reach for. Perfection is God's business." My guest today, Dr. Greg Chasson, is an associate professor at the University of Chicago and a licensed and board-certified clinical psychologist. He argues in his new book, Flawed, that perfectionism is a challenge for management that needs to be addressed if organizations want a thriving and productive workplace culture. In this episode, he will define perfectionism, teach us how to detect it, and give busy business leaders tips for coaching team members through this debilitating tendency. This is E3. Engage and empower with empathy. Well, hello, welcome to the show, Greg. I'm so happy to have you on today's episode. I just finished reading your book, Flawed.
Yeah, great.
Why
Did it put you to bed?
perfectionism is a challenge for management. And I found it super interesting how you mentioned in the book perfectionism is often twisted around as this positive trait in job interviews, for example. So we kind of have this misnomer about what perfectionism really is and how it impacts organizations. So I'm really excited to dig into this conversation a little bit more with you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I think perfectionism is a term that people, I think they sort of get it. They kind of know what it means, but I don't think they know the full landscape and all of the negatives and some of the positives that come with it. And so I'm hoping by the end of our conversation, there will be a little bit more understanding.
I think there will. So let's dive right in. So you present the case very clearly that perfectionism is bad for organizations. It promotes an unhealthy culture, it reduces creativity and productivity. I'm just curious, what observations did you make in your career as a clinical psychologist and a professor at the University of Chicago that compelled you to write this book in the first place?
Yeah, the book really is the culmination of years of clinical work, working with patients with very severe cases of perfectionism, but also this understanding that perfectionism is on a continuum and people fall along this continuum at various levels. And so you have a lot of people who don't end up coming to a therapy room for treatment because their severity maybe isn't as high as other people, or they're not recognizing it, but it's having a profound impact on their functioning on a daily basis. Maybe it's slowing them down in their work that they're doing. They're getting stuck checking and rechecking and checking again. Maybe they're seeking reassurance from their boss over and over and over again. Maybe they're procrastinating and pushing things off because they don't know how to get it just right or where to start. And they then perhaps get stuck in the process of it all. So I was starting to understand that to get the message out about perfectionism, I had to go beyond the clinical setting, beyond the therapy room. And I thought the work environment was a great setting for discussing this because I don't think there's much out there on perfectionism in the workplace. I think it's probably the number one or number two spot where it causes the most damage, maybe other than interpersonal relationships with a spouse or a child or like in a school setting. I think that work is a huge environment where we see perfectionism take a toll. And so I thought this would be a nice intersection to discuss the perils of perfectionism and the workplace and how to improve productivity and efficiency. So that's the origin of this, just to be fully forthright. There's also the personal journey on my end when it comes to perfectionism. I don't talk a great deal about this in the book, but I've had to overcome elements of perfectionism of my own as a growing professional. And it took a few bumps in the road to get to some realizations. And so this book really, in my mind, is an intersection of the research literature, profound clinical experience, and then my own bumps in the road along the way. I think that might also explain why this book has resonated with the perfectionist, him or herself as well. Flawed is the name of the book, is designed for leaders and managers to help perfectionists in their workplace. But I've had countless perfectionists themselves come up to me and say, this book was very illuminating. Thank you so much for writing it. So I think it really is a message that will speak to a lot of people.
It's interesting because I subscribe to your newsletter now, and in today's newsletter, you actually provided an example from your childhood where you
Uh-huh.
were drawing Spider-Man.
Oh
Can
yeah,
you can
yeah.
you talk about that a little bit? I thought that was such a good example.
Yeah, sure. The book had been finished by the time I was starting to put the newsletter together. It was very much a story that I remember and has stuck with me, where I was drawing Spider-Man, and there's very particular way that his webbing on his arms are drawn. And I remember getting locked into this, wanting to make it just right, which is a feature of a lot of perfectionism, is this feeling of not just right. Something doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel quite done yet. I need to get this to where it needs to be. And so I remember as a kid trying to get this so perfect that it ended up completely destroying the picture of Spider-Man. So he looked like he had spaghetti arms by the time we were done. That the point I was illustrating is that the irony of perfectionism, which is that you strive so hard to make something perfect that it ultimately undermines the quality of that product. It's the opposite of perfect. I find that to be a good example in a real life scenario when I was a kid that has stuck with me and probably to a large degree influenced not only this book, but the direction that got me to that book in the first place.
That's such a good example because I think we can all think of examples like that in our lives where we have hints of perfectionism, even if we don't suffer from it on a daily basis. I know I admitted to you when I was sending you the notes for this podcast that I was debating between, okay, do I finish the book cover to cover and then I have everything, all the content in my mind so I can put together the perfect set of notes for Greg's conversation? Or do I give him plenty of time to prep and just send him my notes based on an 80% complete book? And I really struggled with that internally for a little bit until I finally made the decision and overcame my little bout of perfectionism there,
Yeah.
that it's okay that I did not finish the book. I
Yep.
will finish it before our conversation, but it's important that he has my notes well before our conversation so he can reflect.
Yeah, I appreciated that both in terms of having the information ahead of time, but also the meta level example that was right there in front of you of we're having a conversation today about perfectionism, and just that very conversation created this perfectionistic moment. And you actually adopted one of the strategies that I talk about. I believe it was in chapter 5 of the book, the emphasis framework. The emphasis framework highlights different strategies for prioritizing. And so there's emphasis A, emphasis B, and emphasis C, and they represent different effort strategies. Emphasis A is to give it your all, 110%. Lean in and lean in hard, right? Emphasis B is the get her done strategy. Just get it done. Doesn't need to be amazing, but also doesn't need to be garbage. And then there's the emphasis C, which is don't do it at all. And there really is a time and place for all three of these. There's no inherent judgment to any of them. The selection of which one really is dependent on your values and what's important to you in the moment. There's a time and place for emphasis A. If I'm studying to take the SATs, I'm going to work really hard for that. That may be something I value. And so I might study with an emphasis A level. I might even choose to emphasis C some things because they're not important to me. So I might choose not to read the book that I'm doing a podcast on because I'm just going to wing it. It's not that important to me. And I could probably just do this on the fly. Now, I got to tell you, I've been doing some podcasts with this book release, and there are several podcasters who I would say probably opted for the emphasis C approach, who didn't actually do much of the reading of the book. And you could tell, but that was their choice, and I would just roll with it and try to do the best I could. But it's actually nice and refreshing that you chose not to do that and have done something like an emphasis A or B approach with this. Emphasis B really is a thing we should be doing for most activities in our life. We just don't have the amount of resources we need, the time and energy, and that's the problem with perfectionism.
Mm.
They try to emphasis A everything, and that's not sustainable. And so instead of your values choosing emphasis C, it ends up being your perfectionism that chooses emphasis C, because you try to do everything emphasis A, but it's impossible. And so things get pushed off, they get procrastinated. You end up not doing them. And unfortunately, it wasn't based on your values. It was based on this getting paralyzed, trying to do too many things at a perfect level.
Yeah, and I think you provide some really good examples in the book of people like real world scenarios where people are getting paralyzed. I remember an example where you had talked about this really talented hire that was
Mhm.
brought into a company, such high expectations from the staff that he was going to excel because he had all these credentials and he had the
Right.
background. But then he, to your point about self paralysis with perfectionism, he was starting to create barriers for himself and delaying putting together presentations for leadership and things like that. And it was really hindering his potential. Could you talk a little bit more about, and you don't even have to elaborate on that particular example because you mentioned so many good ones.
I think the cases were all composites. I didn't want anyone to read this book and be like, "Oh man, he's talking about me," right? I want you want to be careful that you're not making somebody feel awful about their experience. But there are definitely specific people I could point to that were influential in my case description. But in general, this is a really common manifestation: is the superstar who is reinforced growing up in a setting where they are getting praised and rewards and all sorts of goodies for all of their inherent talents, their aptitude, and they sort of develop this expectation of stardom. And the problem with that is that these expectations are so high and so rigid that by the time they get into the real world, and they're not getting the same level of flexibility that they got growing up. So, you get your rock star student, and a teacher might look the other way if they're a few days late on an assignment. It gets turned in, it's beautiful, it's comprehensive, it's right on point. It's at, a 12th grade level when they're in second grade, that kind of, just a mad discrepancy in terms of where they should be. And so the teachers get excited around this and they think, well, obviously they understand the project and this is impressive and they're going to be the next president of the United States. The problem is that they don't really have anyone pushing them on the process part of it, where they end up getting stuck trying to make things perfect. They're putting 10 hours into something that should have taken 30 minutes. They don't learn how to prioritize. So, in the process of doing that essay, they ended up skipping every friend's birthday party. They ended up angering mom and dad because they skipped dinner. They got into a lot of arguments with their siblings because they were playing too many video games too loudly next door. I mean, so there's all of these impacts that really, I think, get ignored. And then they get into the real world. And this is unsustainable. Like the real world's not going to let you slide on that. And so they end up not having the skills to be able to prioritize, like emphasis A, B, and C. And they end up doing what they know has worked for them in the past, but it leads to a disaster for them. And that's what some of these case studies really highlight is you could be the next Mozart, but it's not just about your talent. You also have to learn how to navigate some of these barriers that you put in your place. And I think a lot of those barriers are critical enough for me to have written a book about it.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. And you are specialized in treating clients with OCD. Can you tell me a little bit more about the connection between OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder and perfectionism? How are they intertwined?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am an expert in OCD. I've been doing it for almost 20 years now. And obsessive compulsive disorder is not the same as perfectionism. Perfectionism is not the same as OCD. They're two separate circles, but there's a substantial overlap so that there's a huge uh, component where they overlap. Individuals experience both. And so this is why I was seeing so much of it in my clinic. I work at the University of Chicago. I'm on the faculty there. And, it's a really rigorous, intense, well respected university. And you can imagine the type of individuals that go there to study as students or as faculty who want jobs there. I would say it attracts a certain person cut from a certain cloth. And so when I got to University of Chicago, I had people with perfectionism coming out of my ears needing help because it's a high stress environment, and it's a pressure cooker, and people don't have the skills they need for dealing with that kind of environment. And so I was seeing it left and right, especially among faculty, staff, and students. I wanted to help individuals, and given my own experience and then the work I've been doing, I had this model, and it was born out of the work I'd done in OCD. It really, in my mind, needed to be projected and scaled in a way that extended beyond the therapy room, because helping one person at a time is really rewarding. This is what I do. But I felt that there was no way that I was going to be able to get the message out at that rate. And so my hope was to write this book, do some speaking, which I'm starting to ramp up, get on some amazing podcasts like what I'm doing right now, write some articles, things of that nature, because I think this message is worth shouting from the mountaintops, because we are in such a toxic achievement culture at the moment
Mm.
that I think it requires some really loud and thoughtful models and frameworks for getting ourselves from under this pressure.
And just to be clear, because you mentioned this at the beginning of your book as well, you're not condoning eliminating perfectionists from corporate. What
No.
you are saying is there's opportunity to help these people overcome what they're suffering from, and that perfectionists can, when treated properly, actually achieve really amazing potential in a company and be really high performing individuals.
Yeah, and I tried to put that a few places in the book because I think it's a really critical point. So I appreciate I appreciate you bringing that up. This is most definitely not a witch hunt against perfectionists. I do not believe that they should be eliminated from the workforce or discounted in your work setting. This is about leveraging the many positive strengths that they bring to the table, and there are a lot of them. But this is about also providing, it's not just about treating. In fact, I wouldn't necessarily even call this treating. From my perspective, treating is a much different kind of approach. This is about creating an environment where they can thrive. So, very much a top down approach. How can we create an environment that really prevents perfectionistic anxiety from getting in the way and all the behaviors, but also promotes flexible thinking, focusing on principles instead of rules, and proper prioritization, and making sure that we're not being overly moralistic with the people around us. So it really is about creating a healthy work culture that breeds all sorts of healthy components like empathy, which I know is critical to your interests and heart, and creating positive well-being and positive regard for others and respect. And I think perfectionism in certain ways can get in the way of that. So yes, definitely not a message of getting rid of perfectionists in the workplace. In fact, I think that would be a terrible mistake, because when they are on the right path and have the appropriate workplace culture, they can be huge assets. I mean, they are some of the most honest, loyal, industrious people on your teams. In fact, conscientiousness is one of the strongest predictors of perfectionism and strongest correlates. And frankly, if there was a single trait I would want in employees, I think it might be conscientiousness. And so, absolutely do not rid your workplace of perfectionism. My book, Flawed, is really designed for you to identify when perfectionism is becoming a problem in your workplace, because it might be something that's coming from the top down in the way that the culture is being set up, some of the messaging that your workplace is putting out there. And it very much is about identifying particular employees who might be struggling with perfectionism, that you might have some tools or ways that you can help them in an individual.
Just hearing you talk about this, I thought of something. You mentioned this with the University of Chicago, how you arrived as a faculty member and you were like, whoa, I am surrounded by people who need my help.
Yeah.
Is there something about the culture or the environment that influences perfectionism, or is it a tendency that comes from within, a personality trait, or
Mhm.
or yeah, the way a person may have been raised at home? So what comes from what, basically? I guess that's the question I have. Where is it stemming from?
It's an inclusive or. The answer is yes, both of those are accurate. We don't know where perfectionism comes from. That's the bottom line. We know that there are certain elements that are biological. There's a genetic component. There is a biological component to temperament that we know plays a role, like neuroticism and conscientiousness and those kinds of things. We also know that learning and environment plays a huge role. in terms of how parents might play a role and the schools that they grew up in and the universities that they select to go to, the people that they choose to put themselves around, friends and spouses and loved ones. So it's unclear where, if it's the chicken or the egg. In fact, I'm not even sure that it could ever be disentangled. You might get twins that are reared completely separately, one in a rural area in Africa and another that's in an urban setting in New York City. And they both might end up demonstrating similar levels of perfectionistic tendencies. You can have completely different environments and they can still end up having this biological drive. And it could be the other way around, right? You could have two adopted siblings that have completely different genetic makeups who end up being in a certain environment together and having a very similar perfectionistic reaction to that. So I don't know that there's a single answer for every individual. And I think it's a bit of a mishmash and a reciprocity between all these different factors.
Yeah, well, which is the case with a lot of things. But I guess
Right.
the good news is influencing the organizational culture will help. And so it's not just, oh, it's genetic, there's nothing we can do. So there
Right.
really is opportunity for leaders and organizations to make an impact. This kind of shifts gears a little bit, but I'm thinking of a previous episode that I recorded with a leader of a large customer service team, and she opened up about her struggle with imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And that was actually by far the episode with the most listens. And I
Uh-huh.
think there's a reason for that, that
Yep.
more people suffer from imposter syndrome than we think. I don't think there's a lot of open dialogue about this. I know that there's a bit of an intersect with perfectionism
Oh,
and
yeah.
imposter syndrome. I'd love to hear from an expert like yourself where you see that intersect happening and why.
Absolutely. Imposter syndrome. I do bring this up a little bit in the book. I do believe that imposter syndrome is often correlated with with perfectionism, and it's largely because of our expectations of ourselves. They tend to be excessive and rigid, and we tend to then get it into this mindset where we're only seeing evidence to confirm our belief that we're not good enough, or that somehow we slip through the cracks and are pulling the wool over people's eyes, and that we don't belong where we are. And so I think imposter syndrome is a very common reaction for perfectionists, because by nature, by definition, perfectionists have excessive expectations that are rigid and unattainable. And so by definition, people are constantly failing. And if you're constantly failing, then you're going to feel like you don't belong. And so I think it's a very common conclusion or daily experience to think that you're an imposter when you're being perfectionistic. Now, what's interesting, and I tell my trainees this all the time, because when you work with trainees, it's a very vulnerable time in your life where, by definition, you don't know what you're supposed to know in order to be the full fledged professional that you're training to be. And so you're sort of in the state of feeling like an imposter, right? But it's actually the case that, and I tell my trainees, is that it never really goes away. And it's a bit of a disheartening concept. But I do say to people, and I think this is true, that it starts to minimize to a pretty negligible level until you get to that next step of your professional career. And so if you've been doing X and then you get promoted to manager X and then to chief X, right? That at each level is going to sort of regurgitate or reinitiate this sort of imposter syndrome. And then it starts to cool down once you get the hang of it. But it never quite goes away. Even when you've been doing the same thing for 10 years, there are moments where you're like, starting to take a step back and you're like, is this right? Is it okay for me to be this comfortable? Should I be thinking more about this? And you start to question yourself. And I actually tell my trainees that not only is it healthy to have a little bit of imposter syndrome, I am deathly terrified of people that do not have imposter syndrome. Because what that means to me is that they don't have much self reflection, that they are not believing that they just sort of have this infallibility mentality and this sort of narcissistic element to themselves where they think, how could you not at some points think that you might be wrong or that you don't quite have everything you need or that you're not doing something correctly? To me, that's a scary concept. And so if someone has a little bit of imposter syndrome, to me, I think that's not only healthy, but I think it's a good sign and I welcome it. It's a problem though when it becomes paralyzing and stops you from doing what you need to do and is extremely distressing. So again, it's a little bit like the Goldilocks zone. You need a little bit, you don't want too much, and you don't want zero. It's a little bit like stress in that sense. You don't want zero stress because then you're not motivated. You don't want so much stress that you're unable to move forward. You want just the right amount. Goldilocks level stress.
Yes, I'm thinking back to the example with the customer service team lead. The reason she was suffering from imposter syndrome was she was managing a team of 5,
Mm-hmm.
and then all of a sudden she was managing 50 people instead of 5.
Yep.
So it was a
Yep.
huge jump in responsibility. And even though she had prepared for this and she was positioned for that role and she knew it eventually she'd be in that role, when
Right.
she was actually there, she almost became paralyzed because she kept asking herself, do I deserve this? Do I know what I'm doing? And maybe this is a good segue into the final question I had for you. You and I really talked about what is perfectionism? How do we detect it? That's great. Now we know how to do that. But for busy business leaders who are trying to position some of their direct reports for more senior roles and develop their employees, how can you find that fine balance between just enough imposter syndrome or just a little bit of perfectionism to really prepare your team as they move up in their career so that they don't become paralyzed and they don't become completely debilitated? I know you had a bunch of really cool techniques that you
Yeah.
propose that leaders use with their teams.
Yeah, I would love to. I think, the perfectionism imposter syndrome, the thing that they really share is some of the behavioral reactions to them. So if someone is feeling like they're an imposter or they're feeling perfection, like they have to do things perfectly, they respond very similarly to both of those experiences. And that is with a lot of safety behaviors, compulsive behavior, a lot of avoidance behavior as well. And so I talk about safety behaviors in the book. And this really has two different types. One is sort of the addition of a behavior, some sort of a compulsive, ritualistic, additive behavior like checking over and over and over again, or seeking reassurance over and over and over again. And then there's the sort of subtraction of behavior, the removing things that are typically expected. And so this would be things like not turning in assignments or not answering the emails, not signing up for that thing that would be good for your career. And so there's this ritualistic side and then there's this avoidance side, and they both serve the same purpose or function, which is to escape or to reduce your anxiety that comes from feeling like an imposter or perfection, like not being perfect. And so a lot of the strategies that I put forth in the book are not about stopping the imposter feeling, because to me, trying to stop a feeling is not something you can do directly. You really need to work on your behavioral reactions to those. So you can function while feeling like an imposter, and you can function while feeling like you're flawed. It's this idea that you can function despite these feelings. And what really gets in the way is the behavioral reaction. So it's about cutting out a lot of those safety behaviors. It's about not seeking so much reassurance. It's about reducing the checking behavior. It's about saying yes and taking baby steps and not procrastinating and not avoiding. And then there are techniques that sort of complement that, such as exposure based interventions, where you have people slowly but surely, in a systematic way, face the very things that are scaring them to show them that they can actually do this, so that they learn that it's not as devastating as they think it is, or that making a mistake is not so devastating, or that the thing they think is going to happen won't, that they'll get fired or that their career is over. So there are lots of strategies I talk about. A lot of them are behaviorally based. That it gives you a little glimpse into my world, which is I'm very much a behaviorist. So I see where behavior can be the most powerful way of changing the way we're feeling and what we're thinking, because that's where we have the most control is our behavior. Whereas with thoughts, we can control somewhat, not what pops in our head, but how we respond to the things that pop in our head. And we have very little control over our emotions, because if we did, I would be out of a job, right? I would snap my fingers and I would just say, stop feeling this way. And that just doesn't work. In fact, if someone says stop feeling a certain way, it just makes it worse, right? And so there's no real direct way of affecting your feelings. You got to do it indirectly. And that's where behavior comes in. And that's why a lot of the stuff in my book is really comes from a behavioral perspective.
I think that's super insightful. And I know I said that was my last question, but I actually thought of another one,
Sure.
because as I was writing the notes for this podcast, I hadn't gotten to the section of the book that talks about managing a perfectionistic boss like a boss. We were just talking about how do you deal with perfectionism in yourself? How do you help your team when they're struggling with perfectionism? But what if the person you report into is a perfectionist? How does that work?
I'm gonna use a joke that I use in the book. Well, the first step would be to ship them my book or to slip it under their door. Joking aside, the first caveat to that question is that there is only so much you can control in that situation. If your boss is perfectionistic, there are things you can do, but by and large, it is out of your control. And so the things you can control, again, your behavior, you can be assertive and open up a line of communication. That's part of what I talk about in that section is how to do that, what to say to them, how to say it to them. And then there's boundary setting, which I talk about in the book, how to establish boundaries. And I know that's a hot topic, especially for younger folks in this day and age. And I do believe in it mightily. Setting boundaries needs to be done with care. It needs to be done in a way that is respectful of both parties and is, considering values of your own, but also the person that you're talking to. And so there's a lot of caveats to this, but I do believe that boundary setting is one way of handling this with the proper communication style. But the bottom line is control is limited. And sometimes the only control you have is not sticking around. I say that in the chapter so as not to make it feel like there is something that is a surefire strategy that will guarantee you results, because that's not true.
I think it's important to be realistic about that. In fact, as I was reading that section, I was thinking of a specific example in my career where I had a perfectionistic boss, and I can recall a specific time when I was on the phone with this person for an hour talking about how thick the carpet on the trade show booth should be. Like that was the hour conversation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Right.
needless to say, I didn't last very long with that boss because I was exhausted. Just every phone call was
Yeah.
exhausting.
And there's a power differential. You're not going to, I mean, depending on where you are in your career and how comfortable you are with this, it's difficult to go up to a boss, especially if you're early on in your career, and
Yeah.
say, I appreciate the opportunities here. I really am excited about helping you with the aesthetics of the convention room floor, but I'm wondering if we can find a way of being a little bit more efficient with the sort of approach. Here are the things that pushed aside. Here are the things that couldn't get done, or here are the things that I was unable to work on. Now, if that's something you think is critical, then I'm happy to do that, right? If that's what you think needs to be done. But
That actually reminded me of the, what is it, the assertive, aggressive. So you were giving me a
yes,
specific type of response
yep,
to that type of behavior from a boss that wasn't aggressive or is very
yeah,
professional. What was the I can't remember the terminology
yeah.
used in the book now.
There's a assertive versus aggressive versus passive aggressive. And a more assertive approach is the way that's going to maximize the chance that you get your needs met, not guarantee it. But it's going to do so in a way that's respectful, doesn't violate the other person's rights and make them feel awful or step all over them. And it's a way that it's not going to let them walk all over you. So I think being assertive is going to be the best strategy. And it's a very difficult skill to practice. And it's especially difficult if there's a power differential,
Mm-hmm.
because you're worried about the consequences of doing something like that. So I do think you need to weigh the pros and cons of being assertive with someone when there's a power differential. But if you're going to be communicative and you feel like it's worth the risk, then being assertive is the best approach. And that really requires making it about you instead of about the individual that you're talking to, speaking more in generalities rather than specifics. And it's about doing it in a way that's respectful, including in the tone and the body language, right? So if I'm saying the right thing, but I'm rolling my eyes and crossing my arms, it's not going to go over well. But if it's about me, like I had a hard time getting all my stuff done yesterday, I think that in large part it was because we spent a lot of time thinking about the carpet on the convention room floor. And so I'm wondering if that's where you want me to be putting my resources during this event planning process. If so, then I'll continue doing that. But if not, then I'm wondering if there's a way that I can communicate to you that I think that my resources would best be served diverted to this. Is there some signal or some way that I can bring that up that would be appropriate to you as a Mr. or Mrs. Boss, right? There are ways of communicating, and it's about, you notice that that was about me. I'm feeling this way. I'm feeling like I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing, or my resources were not being spent in a way that would allow me to get my job done. It wasn't about you being really silly and irresponsible about where I was spending my time. It really wasn't about you being fixated on the carpet. It was about me. And it was general, like in the sense that like I'm worried about where I'm spending my resources. Not so much like this specific moment was a giant waste of time and money, right? It was more general than that. I think there are ways of approaching this, and it does require being a bit uneasy with any sort of power differential. So if you're not ready for that, it's understandable. Do know that saying yes constantly without communicating, though, tends to be corrosive to you in the relationship. So over time, I'm not so sure uh, that the resentment won't eat away at that kind of individual. And I don't typically like where that ends up for most people.
Yeah, and I've been a people pleaser most of my life, and that tends to take you down a path that just you go
Yeah,
into a rabbit hole, and it's hard to get out.
it is. It is because then
It's
people learn to expect that from you. And when you start to be assertive,
yep.
they start to question, like, what's going on? And then you also attract people that sort of take advantage of you because they know that you constantly say yes, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And so when you start to be assertive with them, then they get nasty about it and it can be kind of confrontational. Being passive is not the answer either, but when there's a power differential, you do have to be judicious about who and how you speak, like with whom and how you speak to people.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I will say I was incredibly inspired by what I read in your book. I think this is a topic that isn't really discussed a lot in the workplace and should be.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I really hope more people pick up your book and read it. I understand. Do you have an audio version available soon, Greg?
Very soon. In fact, I'm hoping in the next month. And so whenever people are listening to this would be within August, maybe September of 2024. I'm hoping an
Okay.
audiobook will be available. There's also an ebook via Kindle. You could get it on Kindle Unlimited and read it there with your subscription. Yeah, pick it up. Let me know what you think of it. I love to hear from the readers. I love to hear you, uh, you know, both via reviews, but also just on social media. Come say hello. If you, are looking to spread the message, the book is great, but also I'm happy to come talk and give workshops and talk to people about how to fight perfectionism and how to set up a culture that is anti-perfectionistic, but without sacrificing quality, which I think is really key.
That's wonderful. Let's start a movement.
Let's start a movement. It'll be imperfect, but we'll start a movement.
That's the idea. And
Yeah.
for those of you who are going to read the physical copy, I highly encourage you to read the footnotes. I don't normally read footnotes, but I'm telling you, I got such a good laugh.
Yeah.
Greg has a really, really nice sense of humor. A topic that can be incredibly serious and requires lots of concentration.
Yeah.
I think the humor was speckled in very appropriately and was made for a very good beach read. So thank you for that.
I appreciate it. The footnotes were probably the most fun things to write. So they were fun. I'm glad you got a kick out of it.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Greg. It was really a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I fully support your work, and such an honor to have this discussion. And yeah, for those of you who are interested in reading Flawed, pick it up on Amazon. Greg also has a website, www.gregchasson.com. That's GregChasson.com. Subscribe to his newsletter. I'm subscribed now. It's a really interesting read. And yeah, thanks again.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
This podcast is designed to help busy business leaders create an inspired and engaged workforce. I'm building a community of like-minded leaders and experts who all share the same passion, taking care of people at work. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. If you know someone who I should interview or should be a part of this community, please connect with me on LinkedIn. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.